Behind me is the Ohio River. Now, the Ohio River divides Louisville, Kentucky, at least where I am, from Jeffersonville, Indiana. And divides can be very important. Now, there's one particular divide when it comes to the field of biblical theology that is incredibly important to understand that leads us to one Julius Wellhausen and basically what every modern religion department tends to have. Stay tuned to find out. Let me start you off on one side of the divide. And in order to do that, we need to talk about German tradition in about 200 years after the Protestant Reformation. Now, Luther and what he did in the Protestant Reformation was largely taken as a separation from tradition. He didn't throw it out entirely, but he threw out any traditions that he thought contradicted the scriptures. Now, 200 years later, German Protestants started to notice the same problem. Except this time it was Protestant tradition that was informing how the scripture was going to be interpreted. Now, during this time, scripture was interpreted in a strictly synchronic fashion. That is, you took all of it together at face value. And for conservatives, that's largely still how they take it. However, scholars wanted to go deeper. They wanted to get behind the text. And that's what led to one very infamous speech being given in one infamous college by one infamous man. In 1787, Johann P. Gabler gave a lecture at the University of Altdorf entitled An Oration on the Distinction Between Biblical and Dogmatic Theology and the Proper Objectives of Each. Now, this in particular oration was the first step in separating two disciplines that remain separate to this day, the discipline of systematic theology and the discipline of secular religious studies. Now, in practice, this comes out to one field being more diachronic, as we discussed earlier, and another one being more synchronic. Systematic theology is a field nearly completely distinct from religious studies. What systematic theology does is that it takes all of Scripture, it looks at individual parts, and sees what informs the doctrines that the church holds to today. Now, this is where we get issues of the faith alone versus faith plus works debate. Those are issues primarily of systematic theology, not religious studies. As systematic theology, by its very nature, has a horse in the game. It's trying to make the Bible a consistent message with a consistent whole. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a matter of a difference in discipline, as modern-day religious studies very much does not take the Bible that way. Modern-day religious studies tends to look at the Bible as an evolutionary document, something that starts in one place and ends in another, where you have polytheism at the beginning and monotheism at the end, where you have a Messiah at one point and a triune God at the end. They do that because they're starting from different places. One has to see it as all consistent because they're trying to make things out of a bigger whole, and the other one has no such burden, and so they tend to read it in a diachronic fashion. Now, diachronic is opposite from synchronic, as we already discussed, which takes the Bible as an evolving model, something that starts in one place and ends in another. So, in practice, what this comes out to is a difference in how two major disciplines within the academic world see different portions of Scripture and how they tackle different issues. Let's take the example that I brought up earlier, the issue of salvation. Now, a Catholic systematic theologian would emphasize texts like the Gospel of Matthew and its emphasis on law, and James chapter 2 and its emphasis on faith plus works, and say these are the four main texts that we need to interpret all of these other texts through the lens through because they're clear. And so when Paul says we are saved by faith alone, or we are saved by faith apart from works of the law, then we need to read that in concert with what James says. And a Protestant systematic theologian would say, no. Paul is the one explicitly teaching about salvation, therefore we need to emphasize his text over this one in order to get a proper view of what's going on here. A religious studies professor would look at both of those texts and say, as I've heard many times in a classroom, these are different views. Straight up, they're just different soteriologies. There's no reason we have to read them consistently with one another. So Matthew definitely believes you have to keep the law in order to be saved. James believes that too. Paul is contradicting both of them. And it's only in the mind of a later author that we actually have harmony amongst these people, when in reality, in the early church, there were different views. Now, I'm not endorsing either one of those views, I'm just telling you what the discussion is. But that's what this divide really comes down to. It's whether or not one view sees the scripture consistently and the other just doesn't. Here we are on this side of the divide, and here we can begin to examine even broader the impact that this has on the church and its relationship to the academy. See, the church almost exclusively looks at things through the lens of systematic theology. Religious studies is very, very rare to find in the church. And that's perhaps for good reason, because, in the church, you're trying to take the scripture and apply it to people, liberal or conservative. That's the objective. And so when you have a discipline that says it's consistent and this is the message, that's the one you're naturally going to gravitate to, especially if you have a theological dog in the game. Now, in the academy, I want to preface something, because I don't want to be unclear. There are religious studies professors who look at the scripture in a conservative fashion, and there are theologians, systematic theologians even, who look at scripture in a liberal fashion. Now, those two things are possible, but in my experience, it tends to be more one way than the other, which is why I generalized them the way that I did. The point is, though, is that this divide is very, very real, and if you're not aware of it, you could be walking into something when you think you're getting a good conservative theological education from one perspective, or perhaps a good liberal dissecting of the historicity of Scripture, and getting something completely different, depending on which class or what the background training of your professor is. And all of that goes back to Johann P. Gabler. That's going to be all for our discussion of Johann P. Gabler. Just a real quick housekeeping. I said that this video would be about Julius Wellhausen. I was wrong. What I thought of here was it wouldn't make any sense to discuss Wellhausen until I put him in his historical context. So for now, in particular section, we're going to be going over the figures that led to Julius Wellhausen, so that you can understand how such a theory became popular and even dominant in the field of religious studies. We'll get to him, don't worry. But for now, I'm just going to have to ask you to stay tuned.